Welcome to Technosocial. My name is Daniel Fraga.
And I'm Owen Cox. Here we're talking about all things shamanic, symbolic, occult, and technology.
Consider becoming our patron, donating and helping us continue to pump more of this weird and wacky content from the other side of reality all the way to the comfort of your own screen. We hope you enjoy.
Okay, let's give this a shot. Round 2, connection. Please fucking stay with us. We're here on Technosocial, me and Daniel and Raven Connolly. Hello, welcome, Raven.
Hi, welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you for
I'm already making it my space. I'm like, this is my zone now. No. Thank you for having me.
Well, it chimes in with what I'd wanted to open this with, right? Because Daniel and I don't really know so much about you other than you're involved with Peter Lindbergh's Stoa, where you're doing a lot of hosting, right? So it makes sense that you're welcoming us to your own show. So given that you've welcomed us, tell us about yourself.
Sure. Yeah. So that would be my kind of immediate, I think, breakout into the internet world was through the Stoa, which started in the springtime. And I got introduced to Peter Lindbergh and started doing a lot of hosting and stuff. But before that, I was a student at the Evergreen State College, and Brett Weinstein and Heather Hay were my professors. And I was there during the kind of explosion of the culture wars. And, until that point, progressivism and, anarchism and leftist ideology had kind of been the water that I had been living in. And it was that moment that was a huge inflection and created a lot of tension in my thinking about questioning all of these kind of conformist ideas that were around me. And that was a huge, kind of watershed moment for me that started to get me going. I started reading Camille Paglia. I started reading Nassim Nicholas Taleb. I started getting into the rationalist movement, and reading Slate Star Codex. I eventually got she was an anarchist teacher at the Evergreen State College who introduced me to Nick Land and the neo-reactionary movement. And from there, and Justin Murphy and all of these kind of rogue internet intellectuals, I just kind of went off into, I guess maybe you'd call it a reactionary path of philosophy. But since then, I've just been aggressively consuming content in this milieu, and found Alexander Bard, which just my eyes just exploded when I saw him. And he, I feel really drew me into kind of this, he's an utopian. He has grand theories. He's talking about issues between men and women in this way that's very frank, really draws into things about the phallus, talking about the mamilla, all of these things that really resonated with me. And so when I met Peter Lindbergh, I told him all of this, and he was like, whoa, you have to work with the Stoa. So that's kind of my intellectual trajectory. I also have been really interested in object-oriented ontology and phenomenology. That's how I initially got into philosophy, kind of on my own. So yeah, I don't know. And then I am a carpenter by trade, and really interested in design, getting into VR, and host a lot of groups that read books and talk about philosophy.
That's a hell of an introduction. Out of all of that you just mentioned, is there what's the thing that's the most present in your heart right now that you feel yeah, I want to talk about this? Because it overlaps so much with our interests that we could really go in any direction. So I'll let you have the pick on that one.
Yeah, well, I've been kind of working on my own ideas about kind of uprooting or trying to make a fork in the road in terms of thinking about the female human condition, and really reframing it, because I I'm not very interested in identifying with the word feminist. I don't really like its connotations and the way that it's kind of become. I mean, I think really like a lot of the ideas of feminism have also become like kind of the water that we drink. And I remember being like raised with these ideas. My mother was a feminist, and I was really encouraged to go in these like kind of progressive directions with my development. And I'm finding it to be really exciting to try and come up with my own ideas about what it means to have this body that has this potential latent in it of like, you know, possible fertility, of bringing forth life, of birth. So one of the things that I've been thinking a lot about is kind of building out a metaphysical system or a kind of mythopoetic system that relates to the egg, being the one that is the home of the egg, and how that goes all the way back in our evolutionary history to the moment where sexual reproduction became the innovation of replication, and that asymmetry that is latent in that form of reproduction, and how you have this like one form, you have a single flesh that's divided into these two different aspects, and what kind of comes out of that, and how we share our kind of medium-sized world, our aesthetic world, with all of these other organisms that also sexually reproduce, and how that connects us to nature, and how we have inherited these forms rather than it being socially constructed that we're like sexual or that we are male or female. So that's kind of like where my mind has been going lately.
That I've heard about this angle that connects the mythopoetic expression of whatever it is that we're trying to do right now, namely with your journey with trying to reframe feminism, and then linking it back to this thing that I've never heard before, which is, okay, let's go to the root. Let's go and speak about like when organisms divided into sexual reproduction. So how does that pan out?
Well, I mean, if you take a kind of game theoretic approach, which I studied evolutionary biology, and one of the first things that you start learning about is game theory, and how from very small initial conditions, as those things repeat over time, you can end up with this great amount of complexity. So, you have the game of life, which starts at these like very small initial conditions, and you end up with these like kind of beautiful mosaic patterns of behavior. So I was thinking in a reductionary manner, and I would admit that there's something reductionary about game theory and how it reduces things into principles rather than into the particular way in which they are being manifested. But when we go back, there's like different kinds of sexual like replication, right? Like there's this problem of replication, of getting into the future, and asexually reproducing things can just divide themselves in order to continue to spread and kind of take over territory. I think there's a principle of space that you have to kind of recognize when thinking about this, especially way back when the world hadn't quite been expanded into in the way that it has been now. I think about the tie in this context where there's all this solar excess, and life had to kind of innovate to discover how to use that excess in order to produce their own biomass. And part of that innovation of sexual reproduction was creating the potential for organisms to basically bring that solar excess into their bodies to create more life on the planet. And so I go all the way back, right, to this asymmetry, because I think it's actually really important. It creates a dynamic between these entities of the same flesh, where you have two different principles at work. You have the egg, which is scarce. It's fatty, it's like got a lot of material on it, and that's part of its relationship to scarcity. It's the larger gamete, and it stays stationary. It doesn't move around. And then you have the male gametes, which are cheap, they're plentiful, and they're mobile. They're the ones that go and try and find the egg. And so they're dispersed from one another. So they have this, that's where the spatial dimension comes in. right? So they're at a distance from one another. And there's a necessity in order for these organisms to get into the future for this mobile principle over here to find the egg. And then I also can't help but think about the tie in this context, because you have excess of both of these forms. But you particularly have a lot of excess of the cheap one, and you have less excess of the egg. And then you also can think about it in terms of like membranes. I'm thinking a lot about membranes as a way of understanding, different sets of nested holes. And the sperm has to come into contact and actually transgress or penetrate or move in a kind of sacrificial way. So there's something in intimacy. There's intimacy here in this contact that's being made. And in that transgression, in that kind of sacrifice of these things being separate entities, the condition for the possibility of a future arises. And then you also have all the complexities of how the genes are actually being scrambled. So you have more genetic variation with sexual reproduction than you do with asexual reproduction. And that aids in mutation over time as well. So I think that this principle that we share, we share with plants. Like that's how old this thing is. We share it with plants. Like you look at a plant, you're like, what do I have in common with a plant? It's like, well, every spring, the plants open up with their flowers and you're living in the excess of the plant in its sperm. It's like all over the place. And the flowers are these representations of, I think of a flower as being a hermaphrodite, which is another thing maybe we could get into in terms of what are actually the genders. And Homeopolia obviously talks about this a lot in Sexual Personae. There really aren't just two principles. There's three. And the third is the androgen or the hermaphrodite. And you can see this also in nature. This isn't just like something, it's socially constructed. But the flower has these two aspects to it, where it has like stamens that come out and, show the pollen, but then withdrawn inside the flower, is this like little treasure box where the eggs lie. And the sperm, the pollen has to get itself inside this hidden place in order to fertilize the eggs. So I'm like, I find that to be beautiful. And I find it to be a way of connecting us as biological beings to nature. This like really important inflection point in our evolutionary trajectory that also makes us different from machines and from technological objects. So it also brings in this idea of like what it is to merge with the kind of replication of machines. And I'm still working on how to define how machines kind of replicate and what are the differences. But I do think that that's also an interesting part of what we've inherited by living in this time is living amongst these other replicating beings and almost a kind of war for territory and resources that's happening with these machines. And I see myself on the side of like sexually reproducing organisms, which also kind of puts me on the side of nature in some sense.
Wow. So there's probably a lot to go off on there. I think it's really interesting how like this angle that you establish that has these deep biological evolutionary roots, how it can feed into sort of a mythopoetics and its deep implications on identity and reality, right? Because it's not only social construction, there's an angle or there's an element that has to do with the very nature of the asymmetry between the gametes, for example. And that has implications, you take that small principle, you split it, you give it 1 billion years, and all of a sudden we have what we have today, which is cool. And so I don't know what to ask, but I want to riff on something that you said. So you were asking about like the machines, right?
Yeah.
If there's a dichotomy or even a continuity, right? Because someone once said that humans are the sexual reproduction organs for memes and for technology.
McLuhan, I think, said that.
Okay, there you go. That's our perfect segue. So Do you feel like there's any translation between the logic of biological evolution, the subsequent logic that builds on top of that of sort of the culture and the cultural difference between genders and all of that? And do you think that there's a continuity between these two levels, and then maybe this pure layer of virtuality, of autonomous intelligences splitting off from ourselves? Is there any continuity there?
Yeah, I mean, I would say that there's this really weird thing. So I think I would begin from a position that technology is nature, in the sense that as organic beings, like, we have this latent potential in ourselves to produce technology. And so that is kind of encompassed within my concept of what it is to be biological, that we produce these kinds of things. And then there's also some interesting ways in which I think you can categorize culture and the artificiality of living within cities, of producing a kind of constructed world in which the human subject and the human community ends up dwelling. And I think that an interesting distinction maybe would be one that Daniel Schmachtenberger makes quite often, which is the difference between complex and complicated. The complex being biological, being things that through like all sorts of different kinds of principles are arising in kind of fractal patterns. They have hormesis. If you stress, this gets back to anti-fragility and the Nassim Taleb, right? If you stress an organic system, it actually grows stronger. And that's kind of the beauty or the capacity that complex systems have to adapt. Whereas a complicated system is, defined by mechanics. It has fragile components, right, that can crack and break. It's like assemblages, right? And we're drawn to build those things. We're drawn to kind of co-create with carbon. We've been working with all sorts of different aspects of the like material world as humans for a long time with tool usage. So I would definitely consider there to be some kind of continuity and some sort of, I was thinking about this the other day with like, there's some weird mystery here with why like higher or beings that have creatures that have like kind of complex cognition, like crows or ravens or other types of intelligent birds, are also attracted to things like shiny objects, like metal, and I kind of imagine this like, Neolithic man or whatever, like walking through a landscape and seeing these like shiny little objects in the stream and just being so attracted to their limerence, just they're kind of almost drawing him in, almost asking him to make something of them. And I think that's where, I don't know, it starts to get into this like conversation in the phenomenological world that humans are like picking up on. That's
what's his name? Manuel de Landa speaks of the morphogenetic potential of materials. He says that steel already has embedded within itself the ability to produce, say, the sword or the cannon. And so its potential is embedded within a lineage of technologies. This is the classical example. You have the steel that is used to create the barrel of a gun, which in turn produces the sort of the shotgun and then the cannon, and that in turn ends up changing warfare forever. So there's this broad relationship of they're the same genus, a same phylum to even technologies, even memes. And perhaps from a phenomenological point of view, the way that we relate to it, this is where I'm going to swerve a little bit into the technosocial occult side of things, the way that we relate to this transcendental potential that is latent within technology and the materials is by pursuing sort of a pathic transcendental creativity, by looking into, there's a reason why imagination and the occult have such a prominent role, and symbolisms have such a prominent role in human life. It is as if we are speaking, Nick Land speaks about this invasion from the future. Like there's this egregore, this autonomous intelligent thought form with which, which whispers something to us. And maybe where do you scry the whispers from that entity? Maybe on shiny object.
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. Totally.
Just made a big leap there. Owen, do you have anything to not let me drive the conversation way too much into the transcendental?
Do you know what's coming to mind, right? We spoke to Chris Gabriel recently. We did this episode with him and we were talking about the will, the creative will. And he's a pure Nietzschean, right? And he makes the point that being an artist, being a creative, if you tap into that drive that is what fuels your artistry, that is nature inherent within you. And that is precisely why it is beyond good and evil. I was out in my garden yesterday and I saw a spider eating a wasp in its nest, and it was beautiful and it was horrible. And all at once, right? And I was sitting there with my girlfriend, and she was looking at it and she was like, should we stop it? And I was like, no, like it's just fucking, it's a happening. There is no we can't try and apply our human frameworks to this devouring in process, right? That is the sheer pathos of the naturalistic world, if you will. And that is what when we do art, when we do creativity, and that's why it's so electric. Then against that, we also have the situation, Raven, you were talking about complicated and complex, right? Human civilizations, by and large, we've done a good job at taking the complexity of nature with all its beauty and all of its fucking monstrosity and making it complicated, right? And so we can kind of predict what's going to happen. If you put people through an initiation ritual and an education system through a path of life called slavery or 9-to-5 work, then you can predict the outcomes. You can control information flows, and then you can actually produce something coherent, something that could be geared towards an end rather than something that's just kind of unfolding in a beautiful but unpredictable way. And I guess perhaps where Daniel and I spend a lot of our time thinking, but also more broadly, right, as you mentioned, Bard and Bard's networks, it's about tapping into this pathos again, precisely as a way that we're at a bit of a weird joint point with our civilizations, with our technologies. They're not really functioning how they were supposed to. There's this weird, almost ironic inversion where the modern drive to conquer nature and to conquer the world with rationality, at the very moment we thought we'd got it, it turned around and conquered us. We created these information technologies that are now preying on our minds, and we're addicted to Twitter and to porn and to news feeds and everything else. And where I drive with this, I think there's getting into the real pathos. I mean, like, right, push forwards. There's no like just thinking it through hyper and tweaking the institutions a little bit. No, there's something very, very symbolic, very pathic that is part of the project that we're driving towards at the moment. And I guess that's interesting because it taps into this idea of the feminine principle, which is always perhaps more connected with nature and beyond good and evil. Does that ring true at all?
I mean, I think so. Yeah, I would say so traditionally. It's interesting how women now don't relate to that principle in the same way. Maybe we could get to that at some point. There's so much in what you just said I want to respond to. Do you have anything else you want to say before?
No, that's good. You go.
Okay. So there's multiple things there. One thing I think about the pathic energy. So going back to this distinction between the complex and the complicated, right? Like our institutions, our civilization is complicated. And it can break. And of course, like a lot of the metaphors that are used for like failing bureaucracies is that they're brittle, that they're crumbling, you kind of like use the metaphors of like literal infrastructure in order to describe what happens when these institutions reach a decadent stage. And then I think there's another thing here. I feel like Daniel would probably understand this given ontological design, where the design of the space, like the design of the world that we're in, actually forms the way in which people intuitively want to like understand ontology. So you can imagine these bureaucratic entities actually being of the brittle kind of calcifying system that they exist in. They form themselves into it. And so they are themselves kind of careening into destruction with the systems that they have made themselves in the form of through their interaction with that kind of space. And then this brings me back to the exit and to the pathic, right? Because the beautiful thing that you just have to wake up to is like we are organic, complex organisms. We don't have to be in the form of these brittle systems. In fact, if we get back into our pathic nature, the rational bubbling that is the draw towards the shiny object that comes from some sort of space that we can't completely understand. When we blind ourselves, I can only think of Asafal here, when we cut our heads off, and we just begin to use that other eye, of intuition in order to lead forward into the future, we're leaning on all of this biological hardware and wisdom that can actually allow complex organisms to move through when everything falls apart. Oh, no.
Please. Oh, yeah. Continue. I think there's no issue with the recording. Owen?
Apologize. So the recording is still going.
Okay, great.
Hopefully it should have just rambled on because it should have made someone else the host while I was
It made me the host, yeah. So I think it's probably fine.
Please, apologies for my Wi-Fi rudely interrupting you.
No, that's totally fine. I mean, yeah, so I think that that's part of it is like, and I think that that's something beautiful that I'm noticing in this world is people being drawn to, like, let's say Nick Land or like the neo-reactionary movement, because it gives you this like way of understanding exit, of understanding like you can get the fuck out of this shit. And then I've been listening so much to Hermetics. And I don't know if you all follow Metanomance.
In fact, I just edited our podcast with him this morning.
Oh, beautiful.
We've spoken to him. Yeah.
Oh, excellent. Oh, he's so good. Oh my God. Love him. He's been talking about this the anarch as opposed to the anarchist. And I think this is like kind of perfect archetype to be channeling right now. And especially alongside this pathic principle. If you can kind of cut your head off and like allow for this pathic energy to arise and to build your tribe and to like investigate the world and allow for this like virtuality to arise that is like not out of the form of the constructed institutions, the civilization of which we have been made in the form of. If we can get into that mystery, I think that there's the potential of weathering through. And I think this is part of Bard's exodology, like being part of this class, of this group of people that can weather through this bottleneck of institutional decline, decadence, of the kind of careening of the Tower of Babel, just back down to the ground.
I want to ask you, I want to zoom in on something really interesting that you said there. Extremely interesting. So you mentioned that, whereas we are in a society that is crumbling and therefore we ourselves, or rather the part of ourselves that is designed by that society, also crumbles. You also refer to the fact that there's a pre-existing infrastructure, namely this old biological basis on which we stand, and that in itself constitutes this possibility for exit, this possibility for alternative modes of sense-making, or at least sense-making that is disconnected from the construct, from the autonomous spectacle, and maybe that we can like lean on as this ancient user interface that is of a deep sort of cellular basis. Let's go a little bit deep into that, please.
Sure. I mean, I think this is part of the mystery is like, first you have to open that door. And there's something so weird. This is another thing I was going to that Owen kind of brought up in me is people are having such a hard time considering our relationship to biology. It's deeply disturbing to people that we are bodies, that we are biological bodies, that, the story about, your girlfriend and wanting to intervene with this grotesque but beautiful interaction between two forms in nature. People are kind of, and I think this gets into maybe, the work of Mencius Moldbug and Whig history and progressivism and this idea of intervening with our moral code, not only into nature per se, and to kind of defining or delineating it for our own purposes, as the kind of the people in God's form who are tasked with the duty of, creating heaven on earth based on our moral code, and that we will be rich based on that, intrusion into the natural forces of reality, but also doing that to ourselves, right? And that gets back to this, I like to think of bronze casting. I don't know if any of you are familiar with bronze casting, but I think it's a helpful kind of metaphor. When you're casting in bronze, you basically take whatever form that you're going to make. Let's say you're going to make a bronze cast of a knife, and you make a form of that knife, and then you take that wax form and you put it into sand, and then you build a plaster sand box around it, and then you melt it, and then you pour the bronze into that cavern that you've made. And I think that that's exactly how, that's a principle of how things work. And maybe this gets back to the feminine and masculine principle as well, right? Where you have these containers and then you have these forms filling the containers. And we are either, a form creating a container, or we are the thing inside the container that's being formed. So you have this positive and negative space, and you can see it operating on different scales. And it's kind of, where are you? And that these principles are active in any given situation, which gets back to ontological design, I feel like.
That's why Owen and I are super interested in this, because one of the things that it makes us feel, and that I feel it represents at all these different domains and levels of analysis, is that it represents the willful and skillful and deliberate manipulation of both of these principles in a way that ties the knot back into itself, and then bids the question to you, to here, to now, of what are you going to do? There's a certain Prometheanism to it, which is okay.
Mm-hmm.
So, and that Prometheanism as well, it just feels like, how do you speak about exit from accelerationism, from this techno-capital conundrum? The only thing that really excites the soul is this Prometheanism, this ability to, okay, let's then manipulate all the circumstances of our surroundings. Let's take all the knowledge of both of these principles, and now here's a choice. Now here's a choice between, what Chris Gabriel talks, the regression into the web, which is woven by the digital spider, which seeks to
World Wide Web.
The World Wide Web, or something else. And the word else is beautiful in this regard.
Yeah. I mean, I've been thinking a lot about purging, right? I think there's also language in the decolonial space about this. You have to decolonize yourself. There's, and this is another thing. I think ideology is emergent, right, of other principles that are operating. Maybe this gets back into the kind of discomfort with these weird kind of qualities of being in a hyperobject, right? We have this Cartesian individualism, especially in the United States, right? We just cannot understand a metaphysics where the subject isn't the primary center of all that is operating, with these very delineated lines, which I think also gets back into membrane theory. Once you can think about things in terms of the membrane, you can consider porosity, you can consider nested membranes, how things kind of come in and out of one another, but there is still some sort of form. And people have these planes of existence that are really flat and delineated. And I think that with that kind of way of viewing things, it's a bad bad ontology for understanding how there are these things that kind of arise, or like these convergences, or like these provocations that we're inside of some sort of container of which we are responding or reacting. And that ideology isn't so much like something people are producing, but rather how people kind of converge onto certain explanations for phenomena or like manifest experiences that they're having. And that like, you know, flash of insight that they get when they read something particular, and they're like, oh, this is the thing that's happening to me. And then they kind of converge in a group around this thing. And so you can see this pattern, right? In like the decolonial space, you have people like getting rid of their colonization as like a purge of like modernism, a purge of Cartesian dualism, a purge of these like empirical kind of views of reality. But they only go so far because they still have a pretty progressive view of reality. And then you have the purges that are happening with whiteness. You know, you got to purge whiteness, you got to purge racism. Like it only also goes down to a certain level of reality. Like the purge, I think the purge of exit in particular, I'm just being like, oh, like get it all out of you, you know, like go all the way back to like, you know, the beginning of basically the overthrow of the monarchy, right? Like, like in England, when the Calvinists took over and the Puritans kind of were able to, like conform everybody to their ideological stance, like go all the way back, goes back as far as you possibly can, and just let this stuff come out of you, like in Spirited Away, when No Face comes into the bathhouse and he just like purges all of the trash and pollution and garbage and just like blah, like it all comes out of him. And then like you're in emptiness. Like and you also see this in meditation, right? Like this, like, okay, we're gonna try and get to this place of emptiness and then see what arises. And then maybe that's also why I'm seeing a lot of the feminine principle being how people are interacting with insight. It's a lot of people are talking about receptivity rather than like kind of phallic principle of like going outward, building, designing. And I think that's part of why like Bard is so unusual and his whole movement is so unusual, because it's so phallic. It's like, yes, no, we are building a fundamental system. We are building this whole thing up from the ground. Like we are defining things. We are standing by our definitions. And it's also, you know, ecotopianism. Like we're going to go as far as we possibly can. I think he is a unique kind of individual in that sense. But maybe for the rest of us, at least I feel this way myself, there's a certain kind of like receptivity that I have to cultivate and kind of allow for this arising to occur. And maybe there's also a life cycle principle in it, you know? But I also feel like I'm working on building a virtual phallus. I wonder about that myself. I'm like, okay, because it's like having a penis is not having the authentic phallus at all. Anybody has to build a phallus. Like that's just the principle of the phallus. So it's like, okay, I don't have a penis, but like I could build a virtual phallus. Why the fuck not? Like the androgen, you know, the go-between, you know, the hermaphrodite, like what the hell? I can do that too. So I don't know. That's kind of an aside.
You want to know something?
It's one of the
just a small thing, Owen. Something cool from one builder to another. It's interesting that the point, if you're looking at how, let's say, cults can be built, in the process through which you have to put consciousness through when you're actually like preparing someone to be inducted into a cult, there's always this structure that you mentioned. There is a purge of a previous identity. There is a moment that is so intense that it will leave an emotional imprinting in your heart, which you described in this case as being this moment of sort of pure receptivity. And then from then on, something can be built. Well, what is that something? Whatever the builder wants.
Yeah.
That's the point. Who is building right now? That impulse will either be taken care of by accident, by big tech, or by sort of mimetic insurrections, the kind of which we are trying to describe here. Does that make sense?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Owen, were you going to jump in?
Yeah, I was going to reflect on the fact it's interesting, right, that Bard is this outrageously camp androgynous figure, and he is precisely the one who drives the phallic, where over in the slightly more game B metamodern type space. I think the leaders of those movements, if you will, might be described as more traditionally masculine in a sense. And yet there is not this same drive with the phallic energy. And I'm not quite sure where I'm going with that, other than to call it out as a curious observation. Right? I don't know if it's something in the androgynous character that is able to more intuitively sense where both masculine and feminine principles are, and thus call out more aggressively which one is lacking or needed, precisely because there's a more kind of embodied understanding of both, or what else it might be. There's also the fact, right, that he's a pop star where everybody else is a kind of traditional academic or business person, which also throws things to the wall. I think there's stuff that you experience in life as a high artist that don't quite come through in the same kind of rigidly constrained environments of academia or business lifestyle. Something about standing in front of the masses and channeling intense emotions through them. Typically the sex, drug and rock and roll lifestyle, right? It's pathos again, right? But okay, so now we're back to this point, right, where I'm wondering is there an association, say, with pathos with a particular gender, or does pathos have masculine and feminine elements? Is pathos kind of prior to them? What do you guys think on that?
I think it's prior. I think it's prior. I mean, like, I think the pathic to me is related to this. Well, I mean, maybe there's like masculine and feminine aspects to it. I don't know, maybe we could work this out a little bit. But so if we go back to this idea, if we go back to this idea of this kind of problem inherent in this like singular flesh problem. So you have these beings of the same flesh that are in a kind of monist way. They're the same thing. But yet they're divided into these two principles, one of the egg, the other of the sperm. And the sperm has to get to the egg. That's drive, baby. That's drive. Like, that is like unexplicable drive. Like, you can't explain it. It's pre-rational, and it's so deep inside of you that you just are hysterical. And I think that there's also a feminine principle here where we might associate pathos with like kind of movement or some sort of like masculine principle that's related to the movement of gametes, right? Or, I've been reading also The Sexual Cycle of Human Warfare and kind of thinking about that, exogamy, and how this principle kind of arises and moves into all of these different scales. But the egg also has drives. The egg wants to be fertilized, and that's also a pathic energy. It's a kind of receptive pathic energy. And I think female sexuality is something that is very misunderstood, or at least not very well studied or not very well contemplated. Philosophy has definitely not really done its work to understand the principle of sex from the perspective of the female body, which is part of why I'm interested in working on my own kind of like metaphysics of this thing. If we take like a idea of philosophy or worldview kind of arising out of the conditions of the body and the way that the body interacts with the world, and like the kind of principle of pathic energy or logos or mythos that comes out of being in this container that has certain kinds of form to it, where I am like there's an arising that comes into me that I have and that I'm listening to that is of my body. What kind of philosophy comes out of that? Right? And like the fact that autistic men have been writing Western philosophy most of the time, that's going to give you a certain kind of worldview. And it's beautiful. It's created in like insane, incredible things, but it's also missed a lot. And I see this opportunity now to just begin to work from first principles again. And this goes back to the idea of purging. Work from first principles. Like none of these things that are out there to just like take on and wear any of these ideologies that people are just like, you know, here, pick my ideology, pick my brand. Here, like, join my mass movement. It's like none of those things are answering the deep questions of human nature right now. Like, no way. Especially when it comes to being in the female body. I like firmly believe that. The only person that I've really heard talking about this in a way that's compelling me personally is Nina Power. That's it. So I think the pathic in the female is different. It's different. But you know.
Yeah, tell me more about that, because like feminism is basically too patriarchal, right? That's the provocative critique to throw it in. It's like women's equality by making women like men. The moment that women are able to do trade and politics, these traditionally masculine, and the minute that women can go out and conquer males with their sexuality in the same way that men can go out and conquer women with their sexuality, then they'll be equal. And so strong, powerful individual women. And that's kind of where we're at in terms of mainstream discourse. So what is a pathic feminine sexuality? I
mean, I think you can see it just if you just go into the Onlyfans world, like it's pretty obvious. I don't know if any of you guys follow Ayla, but she's like a rationalist porn queen. She's great. I think she's my access point into that world because she's like very systematic about how she approaches her, her work. You know, she's like, I would say, one of these kind of androgynous, I think ultimately androgynous, like sex worker, sacred prostitute kind of people. And the kinds of videos that she comes up with, I think really tap into this idea of like what the pathic is for the feminine. It's very much this, and you can see it all over the legacy of Western art. Oh my God. I mean, it's so pornographic, you know, and this is what Palia talks about the whole time, like the certain kinds of gestures that women do. And you look at these videos of like revealing, you know, of like being in this desiring position to be witnessed, right? Like to create the conditions of being receptive has certain signals associated with it. And I think that also, you can see that dancing in the kind of shadow psychosis of men, you know, of wanting to like know that that's true or real, and understanding there's a deceptive aspect to it, that like men are being kind of captured and used, like the spider, you know, capturing the wasp in its nest, you know, and like eating it up and sucking it, you know. It's like, so I think that it's just a different trap. And you can see this in the animal kingdom, right? Like with plants disguising themselves. Or there's a great example of the orchid praying mantis. It like pretends to look like an orchid, and this you know, the little bugs come up and try and like get in, and then the orchid like snaps it up and eats it, or the orchid mantis like eats it, right? So there's this deception principle that's involved in receptivity that you can see all over in the organic world. And I think that is like a kind of aggression. It is an aggression.
It's so cool because the way that I was going to formulate the question that Owen just asked you and that you so masterfully answered was more like, okay, if you had to package these insights into something that sounds more mythopoetic, more metaphorical, more symbolic, because that's kind of how, you know, we are able to exchange these insights into the abstract in a way that's more fungible, more exchangeable. And you just described the femme fatale. You just described the lure of the veil of Isis, right? Is there anything else that comes to mind in this flow of symbols? If you had to like tell a story around it is, what would you say?
Well, it's interesting. I think that, well, I don't know. I don't know. Yeah, I mean, I think this is kind of where maybe something about the androgen comes in, or something for me that's weird about like sex bots or pornography, or like this kind of this idea of the decoy, you know, this like fear in like the masculine principle that like you're kind of, well, that's the other thing. So you have these like dance between these two entities, right? And the male has this like quality, you know, of the moth to the flame, where if he's looking for these signals of receptivity, like, you know, the nape of the neck or whatever it is, like, or breasts that are engorged or whatever, like these, or dilated pupils, right? Like these signs that there is someone who is receptive to his advances, his pathic energy. And it's very easily captured. And I think men are attentive to that. And it kind of is the shadow, right? And so there's these weird things going on where men are caught in like the kind of the limerence. And I think that this is something actually that Chris said about our screens. They're not just neutral. They're actually magnets. And that's exactly what a receptive thing is. It's not neutral. It's not neutral to just like be a beautiful woman. It's something that magnetizes. And we know this. We know this. You sit outside on the promenade and you're looking at people and your eyes just go right to the beautiful people. It's just a kind of magnetism that certain people have. And you feel a little like, oh, like I shouldn't be looking, but you're like, oh, I can't help myself, you know? And that's like being captured by pornography, by sex bots, by people who appear in one manner, but actually are of another. And I think that's also where the androgen or the hermaphrodite sits in such a interesting place within our kind of history. And I'm reading Sexual Personae right now, right? And so one of the things that Palia talks about is like in the social novel, which is very popular during like the Romantic period, the androgen was always treated in this very negative light as this kind of like, you know, this force that was going to like ruin the social cohesion. And the end of the social novel often involved marriage, kind of like at the end of Shakespeare. You know, you have Rosalind and all of these characters who kind of go between, they're totally being androgynous and they mix everything up and they confuse all of the social dynamics. But at the end, everybody has their harmonious marriage, their heterosexual marriage, and stability of society is maintained, right? So there's this kind of like shadow or this haunting of the androgen that you can see in the certain forms of narrative that go through periods of Western history. And then you have other periods. I just finished the chapter on Emily Bronte, where her book, Wuthering Heights, there really isn't any conclusion. It's basically just the androgen leading to destruction, and that's kind of it. You know, like there is no like perfect marriage at the end. And I think that that's why, you know, there's certain figures that Palia particularly likes. Like she loves Blake, right? Because Blake just like channels the great mother, the devouring mother, and its forms. And there's no conclusion to those things. They just exist. And those forces are acting in the world. So I guess those are some mythopoetic examples.
So I think you have this positive and then negative aspect, or rather shadow and conscious aspects of the mythopoetic dances that both sexes do when they are in this sort of mating dance throughout the ages, right? Is there any teleology to this, especially taking into account, you know, accelerationism and technocapitalism? In other words, do you see this dance that, you know, in Shakespeare's times was instantiated into symbols in one way, and in our days is being instantiated into the symbols of the mainstream in yet another way, with the struggles of feminism, with the struggles of, you know, the manosphere and all this stuff that we're witnessing today? You feel like is it pointing to something? Do you feel like there's an exit, or is it really just unresolved as it is at this point? Because you just kind of elaborated this new aspect, this, which is brilliant, right? To articulate this female perspective point of view on the female pathos, especially in the digital age, right? And how it has sort of this shadow aspect and positive aspect as it relates to the male, which is kind of a moth to the flame.
Yeah, I wonder if there's some sort of conclusion. Something, I guess this taps back into one of this, like the mysteries, right? Something that I have been thinking about, and this does kind of relate to the kind of cyborg nature of most women now. especially women who are of like reproductive age, who are on birth control. The change that has happened due to the changing of the risk. So that's the other thing about, being human that is different from other kinds of organisms. That is a kind of particular type of condition in terms of this asymmetry between the different gametes, and how that relates or spins out kind of into the fertility cycle of either sex. There's some organisms where there's a very narrow window where you're actually fecund, where you could actually be impregnated. And the signs of it are very obvious, like a baboon, asses swell up. I mean, you can't really you can't really look away from that. You're like, oh, this is really very obvious. And maybe this also gets into kind of this like withdrawn kind of like the way in which women are kind of portrayed, right? Where you're not quite sure whether or not they're receptive. You're not quite sure whether or not this is the right time that they're going to be, reproductively available. We have this weird cycle where it's like we're available for pregnancy all throughout the year. It's not related to seasons, but it's also like a narrow window within our cycle that's kind of mysterious as to when it's actually happening, where pregnancy is really possible. And as a person watching or looking at this woman from the outside, you're not quite able to tell. Besides these really, really minute signals that operate on this like very unconscious level. Like there's been studies done that strippers who are ovulating make more money, for example. Mm-hmm. So, men can tell, but it's not something rational that you can just charting and really like create a cartography of. Yeah.
Because that reminds me of when Alexander Bard speaks in nomadology, and he draws this from Deleuze, that in the primal nomadological tribe, when we were 150 people crossing the steppes, there was a king and a priest. There was always the matriarch, who was the person responsible for saying when you can and cannot have sex, because the tribe could not run the risk of having a baby in winter because they're going to die. So they had to really regulate the sexual cycles in this way. And you also mentioned something very interesting, which is, we don't really know when the woman is fertile because it's not like a baboon. There's not a specific time. And that has given sort of the human, from the little that I know from evolutionary biology, that has given human evolution kind of, that's maybe the trigger point for the ankle point in the evolution, meaning that's when we were able to perhaps select ourselves better. Maybe women were the selectors in that sense. Does this ring true from like your knowledge of evolutionary biology?
Well, it really, human beings are so flexible. It's really quite amazing. It's very hard to generalize. Yes, we share these bodies that have these underlying principles, but how different human communities, like you speak about this idea of the tribe and the matriarchs, and being able to kind of determine and be the authority of when and when not to engage in sexual activity to avoid certain kinds of pregnancy at inopportune times. Like that's one form of interacting or engaging with the sexual cycles of the tribe. But if you live in a tropical place and there's no winter, then how would that change the dynamics? And if you live in a place with like low amounts of resources, you may have a completely different mating structure, right? You may have one male for every 5 females who is, they have more land, and then there's a bunch of other men that have to go kind of wander the desert to go find reproductive opportunities. So I also think about it, it's like very difficult to generalize. And I think that that's why we have to look at our particular mating dynamics today and then cross it with a lot of different historical examples, try and get some context and some understanding about, what it is that's going on now, which is like kind of a disaster between the sexes.
I want to say something that's gonna, draw the ire of so many people, but I don't give a fuck.
Love it.
So the notion that different positionings in the globe vis-a-vis resources, vis-a-vis climate, and the idea that might have instantiated unique manifestations of the relationship between culture and the sexual cycles, that that might be an angle with which to look into the differences in culture. Some people say that winter had a domesticating effect on certain cultures and its cultural manifestations and forms, and the way that the sexual cycles were regulated in those cultures versus other places and other people that have manifestly evolved culturally different dynamics in that. Now, that said, in 2020, the game has, gotten exponentially more complex than that. And not to go too deep into the previous subject, I don't know. I just wanted to drop that in because I feel like it's such an important factor. This cultural aspect. You mentioned the pill. The pill is Pandora's
Huge.
box has been opened. It's what
Huge. Such a big deal. No, like nobody's talking about the pill the way that they should be. I mean, it's like, and especially like so many generations in. Like, the fact that my grandmother had access to the pill, and my mother and me, right? Like that's 3 generations of women and kind of having the choice. But I wanted to say something else before we go on to that, about what you mentioned with different, climates and kind of a geographical determinism type of argument, which I think once again, back to this idea that it's like deeply uncomfortable to people to think that like, oh, as biological organisms, we may be formed by our locality and by like the climate systems and by the resources that are around us, and that may have something to do with the trajectory of our civilization. Wow. To me, that's like kind of a no-brainer. But whatever. I think also, infanticide is a really important looking at here. So, and also that leads into human sacrifice as well. So there's this issue of balancing, flesh. I think of it in a way. I mean, it's kind of weird, but if you like, for example, you take a, civilization, agrarian civilization that goes through boom and bust cycles, you're taking, but let's say you not only have grain, but you also have herds, you have cattle, or you have some other kind of organism that you can feed the grain to during like boom cycles. So you can kind of store the grain in this other organism, and go through a bust cycle. You can then kill the cattle and eat them instead of killing the people, either through starvation or through human sacrifice or through war. And that way you're kind of moving around where the resources are in a way that kind of, because there's a certain amount of like nutritional resources, and it's if you lose one, it has to go somewhere. And so I think that there's been these systems that have arisen from the intuition kind of human beings organizing themselves on complex scales to deal with population control in order to weather through boom and bust cycles that happen in an agrarian society. And I think that, you can see in the Aztecs, like they obviously had huge rituals of so I think that that's kind of an interesting principle as well. And you can look back at all sorts of different human communities and cultures, and the place at which a child is considered to be like a child changes. For some cultures, it's like, for ours, for example, like the preciousness of a fetus is like the moment of conception is like where something is considered to be a child that is like has the right to life. But in other cultures and other periods of time, even in Western history, the same lineage of like kind of Christian theology that we have now, the baby wasn't considered to be a child until it was like, maybe a year old. Mm-hmm. And there were these conditions in Europe during certain periods where women were just abandoning their babies in the streets because they just didn't have the resources to take care of them. And that I'm reading a book called Mother Nature, which is written by this like incredible evolutionary biologist and anthropologist named Sarah Baffer Hardy. And she goes through this huge anthropological investigation of this period in European history where women were kind of just abandoning their children in the streets, and how it relates to the grim fairy tales. Mm-hmm. And like this idea of like the changeling, or these like weird babies, you know, who are like, or they're being stolen by witches, you know, and all of these kinds of things, like almost as if it arises in the psychology of the stories, how people are viewing infants and the kind of psychological dynamics of a woman who is basically having to repeatedly, in some cases, abandon her babies because she can't abort them and she can't prevent pregnancy. She's basically has to like toss it. So, you know, this is part of like the female human condition as well, of like how it relates to abortion or infanticide. And I think that also gets into the principle of the devouring mother, right? That the devouring mother can give forth life, but she also takes it away. And the infant and the mother are actually in conflicting dynamics with one another, you know, and that's where we have to kind of get out of this, you know, Mary with her baby and she's going to take care of it no matter what. It's like, no, that's not the only mother principle. There's also the mother Mary, the shadow Mary, that like tosses her baby, devours her baby, controls her baby, eats her baby. And I think that that's something that is like kind of, you know, definitely a shadow aspect of the way in which we view women contemporarily, we view mothers. And we also then treat women who are either non-reproductive or who are bad mothers. It's all kind of in our like the water that we drink of our society.
That's interesting. It feels like until we are able to manifest and articulate and understand that principle, it will continue to exert tremendous power over us, the collective psyche, until we formulate it. That's what we see in the myth of the internet and of the spider and all of these femme fatale things. And obviously, we haven't sorted that out. If we look at culture, I want to look into two things that you mentioned right there. One of them is that there's so interesting, right? If you look at you mentioned something about the time at which the child was considered to be a child and not sort of a fetus that was not deserving of a category subjectively of human. That's probably got something to do with the advance of medicine and its ability to curtail infant mortality. Yes. Because today, any kid that's born will probably stay alive. That threshold has become much lower and went all the way back to somewhere before birth. You know, back 200, 300 years ago, the hygiene and medicine conditions were not so high. So kids were dying left and right before the age of 4. So we might as well not even consider them human before the age of 4 from the, you know, discursive normative regime of truth that, you know, ruled that time. And then like to go back to the initial part of what you were just saying in this part, which was so cool. You mentioned like there's this chessboard, right, of the allocation of calories between, you know, the grain in the field, and maybe you have some cattle, maybe you have too many bellies to feed, so you might as well sacrifice it and create some, you know, take the calories that would have been wasted in these surplus people, either send them to war, send them as lone wolves to fuck with other tribes, or just sacrifice them and take their latent potential, break it, and open it up on the sphere of belief, which is why the priest was the one conducting the sacrifices. Because like nothing is lost, nothing is created, everything transforms, right? So It feels like this grand chessboard where geopolitics becomes the great chessboard of biology as well. It is the point where, not through the mind of the emperor, but perhaps by the dynamics of the system itself, all of these things balance themselves out somehow. The calories of the cow, and maybe you make some beer out of the grain to keep your people drunk because they're easier to control. Maybe you sell vodka, make a buck, keep your control. And it stumbles down through Eden all the way to Armageddon, which is this inescapable sort of flash of time. I don't know. Do you have any thoughts, Owen, Raven?
Well, the other thing I think is interesting in terms of like what was happening in the old world, so-called, and the new world was that there didn't have domesticated animals in this, like that domesticatable animals, like herding animals here in the New World. And I kind of wonder about how that relates to human sacrifice, because you can sacrifice a cow, and that kind of like moves that energy of like human sacrifice in this like great chessboard from the human flesh into the flesh of the cow. So there's it kind of an interesting thing there of like an alchemical process of kind of transforming how you make sacrifices and how you end up that kind of like working with these asymmetries, right? Kind of trying to prepare yourself or anticipate kind of these like future states, and then also kind of coping with the conditions as they shift in one direction or another.
Let me throw something else. The point at which the management of this equilibrium, right, that you were just describing, maybe you have too many kids, maybe we shall have to throw them down the pyramid and use that to fool all the other people. That management, that equilibrium, I think it gets to a point where it is not explicit like we're formulating it now. You can't really create this Trello board for how to fucking manage society in that sense. But, when these things become so abstract, I argue that the priests and the shamans have this intuitive capacity to formulate them in myth, right? That's, when stuff is hard, you tell stories about it. Human sacrifice is a nice one from that regard, because, Aleister Crowley and all these weird occultists, they speak about human sacrifice. But one of the interpretations, one of the coolest ones that ties just again back to what we were talking about, was that human sacrifice, the killing of children, the sacrificing of children, is in a way something that is currently happening with pornography. In other words, when the man wastes his libido in this world wide web of the vicious, malign spider, being sucked by this regressive property, which is, again, shout out to Chris Gabriel for this beautiful concept. What is actually happening is you're sacrificing your unborn child. You're sacrificing your future. You're actually like a moth to a flame, but in a bad way. You're being deceived by these wavings of the shawl of the digital devouring mother. Which in turn, sorry, just to elongate myself, it relates to what you are always talking about, Olin, the castration cult.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yes, absolutely. I'm glad that we've wound up back here, because this was still sticking in my head from about 20 minutes ago, right? I found it super cool. So you mentioned, I was asking about female sexuality, right? And you bring up Ayala and Onlyfans, like you can really see it in play, right? And that is a dynamic where the female content producer has so much power over the men. There's this like humongous attention. There's no longer being subservient to a producer or any kind of contract. You put out your stuff, you get paid for it. Bang. And as Daniel said, the flip side of that is that it's like a hoover for male libido. And one of the big issues facing men right now, right, is pornography addiction. And just guys getting hooked on this stuff because it's there when you're young. And it's just so damn good, basically, in along certain axis, right? Like in terms of actual real human intimacy, in terms of having to be a man attractive enough to attract a woman and thus growing as a person, no, sucks. But in terms of sheer enjoyment, sheer absorption,
hyper-normal stimulation. It's kind of maybe a dry way of putting it, but yeah.
Yeah. And we have to refrain from doing some kind of value judgment here and then saying it's good or bad, it's right or wrong. But it is a humongous power asymmetry that suddenly emerges. And where I'm curious, being involved, well, number one, as a man, number two, as a guy involved with men's work, right? It's like, we need to do something about helping men to reclaim their libido a bit from this devouring mother vortex. And that's not a kind of moralistic or absolutist no porn, bro. It's not no fap, or it's not any of these other kind of cults that emerge around masturbation or digital sexuality. But there is, I think, or Chris Gabriel in his video, right, was talking about precisely what happens with the the male with the paw. It's, as Alexander says too, it's the mamilla. It's everything you want. It's the mother that you suck on the tit and it gives you as much milk as you want. But it doesn't teach you to be courageous. It doesn't teach you to go out and to approach girls, to conquer. Essentially, that's Peterson, right? It's pure Peterson. Go out, dragon. So
I just want to jump in and say one thing, that women are just as sucked up into this as men are. This is two sides. This is two sides. Like, I do hear a lot of the talk about the men, and I see that, but women are also trafficking in the production of this stuff. And it is now so, like you said, it's now you can be your own producer, that, you know, now women are kind of capitalizing on their own, like kind of receptive signals to suck men in. And it's, you know, the asymmetry, the power asymmetry may be that, you know, you have these essentially whales on the female side, these like women who attract huge amounts of money and men. Like, it's insane. All of these micro payments, like, and it's really interesting to me because there's also this principle in female aggression where women kind of like try and keep each other in the same plane, let's say. You know, you'll notice that women like to hang out with other women who are like just about as attractive as they are, just about as, you know, smart as they are. You know, they don't, and there's all these stories, and I think Jordan Peterson actually talks about this as well. Like, you could look at Cinderella or White, like all of these stories about these, like, this exceptionally beautiful woman who has these exceptional qualities, being the kind of scapegoat for all of the attacks of her stepsisters or her stepmother or all of these other female characters who have less of those qualities. So there's been this dynamic in female aggression, which is another thing that hasn't been, you know, really like unearthed, I think, in the same way that male aggression has been, that women kind of passively try and keep each other kind of in the same strata of power and influence. And reproduction has been constrained, right? You can only have, you know, you can only be pregnant, you know, once every 9 months, right? So like, let's say you have one exceptionally beautiful woman in a tribe. She can basically only really give the bounty or the benefit of that to a single person at any given time. But now that there's been a decoupling, you can see this pattern kind of borne out, or at least this is my hypothesis, that actually the female power actually allows for this winner-take-all effect that's even more dramatic than when men engage in these dynamics, when they're kind of unleashed. And the inequality on OnlyFans is like more drastic than the most unequal societies in the world. Like, there are these huge winner-take-all effects. And I think part of that is like the female, like the exceptional female characteristics that everybody is like normally trying to get at, but basically have been constrained or contained, them being unleashed and it being kind of democratized, that anybody can have access to it, basically causes that female power to just accelerate in its capacity to take control of huge demographics of people. Which is really weird.
Is there a kind of mimicking dynamic where it's like almost women getting sucked in because it's like, hey, I want to make money off my nudes. And so it like becomes an attractive thing that like the pull of power is like, hey, that sounds like a fun, easy, cool way to make money and get attention and tap into what Chris Gabriel like geniusly calls like there's an anima to the internet, right? And that like behind all of these prophetesses that appear on the screens, there is this like the spider, I guess we can call it. And it's super interesting, right? It's like, is it because the spider sounds, well, actually, no, it doesn't. I was about to say the spider sounds cruel and kind of terrifying to a conversation earlier about the spider and the wasp, right? The spider is just a spider. And the prophetesses of the spider hanging out on the web expels as they do. And it works.
Well, I think part of it is that like you can, and I think actually Chris pointed this out, like a lot of people in the manosphere, they like scapegoat women for this problem. But like the fact of it is both are actually attracted to the screen. You can kind of imagine that there's this like, you know, screen in the middle, there's men on one side, there's women on the other, and they're like interfacing with each other. But really they're both being drawn into the limerence of the screen itself, both of them. And so that's really where the power lies, but you can see it accentuating these asymmetries in the kind of underlying dynamics of the sexual aspects of men and women, the human men and women, you know, in the digital sphere, unbounded. I mean, it's like, you know, and this is the principle I think Nick Land really like brings forth. It's so useful in terms of thinking about like the unleashing of zero, right? This idea of like there being these control societies that basically kept certain kinds of forces contained, because if they were to accelerate so fast, the metastability of the culture would actually fall apart. And that we see this like this principle of this like techno-capitalist entity, this egregore, it's just pulling the tops off of things. It's just like unconstraining everything. And so this is one aspect of that unconstraining principle working its way into the sexual dynamics between men and women.
Let me throw a theory at you guys and see what you think. So I want to connect back to that idea that I was, talking a while ago about the grand chessboard of the management of human resources, be they calories, sexual potential, ideas, whatever. And, in the sexual nature of human warfare, there's this idea that whenever perhaps some society has way too many reproductive aged males, they send them somewhere else to either, fuck with other societies and do war and get something from for themselves, or just die. Why? Because they can't really stay. Otherwise, that affects the sustainability of the home system. We're 8 billion people now. And when I look at these questions around pornography and Onlyfans and all of that, and this twisted sexuality that is becoming more and more attracted to its own dark reflection of this animus and anima, this is a genetic sinkhole. This is where child go to be sacrificed before they're even born. And that feels to me like precisely the thing that happens when a big war happens. Namely, there's an evolutionary bottleneck. Only the few will be able to pass their genes on to the next generation, whereas the rest will be dead in an orgy of the last magic. If I want to paraphrase Eliphas Levi in his History of Magic, he says that in the old Babylon, the old Magi, they knew that Cyrus the Great was at the door and of their city, and that he was about to conquer the city, and they had this warning, but they chose to disregard that warning, and they went out in a massive orgy that was so big, and because they had magic, the night became clear with all the light that emanated from that magic. But that was the last that they were ever heard of, and that's why the world no longer knows any magic. It feels like right now, right? We have a century before this happens, less than a century perhaps. It feels like there's such a convergence, such a singularity, such an exit, which will not be for the many, it probably is going to be for the few. I don't know, I'm speculating at this point, but I just want to throw these words at you guys. Genetic sinkhole, evolutionary bottleneck, and then a great chessboard of the allocation of resources and capital and libido.
Yep. I'm just there with you. I think that this is something else that Polya just really almost redundantly explains in Sexual Personae, which is the androgen character, the hermaphroditic character, is self-fertilizing, and in that sense also self-extinguishing. It is a genetic sinkhole. And I think the other kind of discomfort of going back to this principle of the discomfort with this kind of biological intuition kind of working itself out, in the hyper object of humanity, kind of being a force moving the population dynamics over certain timescales that we don't fully understand or can't rationally understand or manage or predict, is you see this principle that's leading people towards conclusions, either consciously or unconsciously, of antinatalism would maybe be one way of talking about it. But yeah, I mean, we have a huge spike in people who are attracted to identifying as queer or non-binary, or women going through it's just descriptively so, a self-sterilization process of transitioning. And then we also have, of course, this addiction towards pornography, but women also producing pornography rather than, going out and finding mates and committing themselves to relationships where they would bear the fruits of their fertility and actually bring new human life into the world. And then you also have women who are going into business, kind of the feminist, go off and be like a man, which basically in a way is also a certain kind of sterilizing process, because to be like a man is not the same kind of fertility dynamic as being a woman. And so to take on that form is to actually become androgynous, and to bring forth creativity, or business or whatever it is, to give birth to these kinds of entities, especially in the brutality of the capitalist system where there's so much intense competition. It requires so much commitment, so much time, so much dedication, that any other type of activity of family, of intimacy, of relationship building is by the wayside. It's delayed. And the thing of it is, as a man, you can delay because your body is pretty much stable for most of your life. Like once you hit your prime in terms of the fullness of your secondary sex characteristics, if you're a man who takes care of himself, you can be fertile till 70 and pretty much look the same. Maybe you'll get a little bit of gray, but there's also this, totally this trope of the George Clooney, this kind of rugged older man who's still sexy. And for women, it's the whole dynamic is completely different. And I think this is really interesting as it relates to the Dionysian principle. A woman is basically continuously going through metamorphosis. There's basically no stop on the road. And I think birth control intervenes in a kind of Apollonian way. It freezes, a woman in this kind of certain state of sterilization. It's effectively a kind of sterilization. It's it's a chosen one, and people absolutely have the right to do that, but they choose to kind of freeze themselves in the situation where they're not realizing the potential of their fertility. But it's not really freezing, because all of these other processes are still at work in a woman's body. And when you hit 40, and you finally the biological clock is knocking on the door. And finally, you can't ignore this drive that you have for children. And you go through a kind of midlife crisis, and you're like, oh shit, actually, I want a family. What the hell? No, I'm 40, and I haven't had my period in 2 decades. What the fuck am I supposed to do? And then women start kind of seeking the realization of their fertile potential. And a lot of them, they can't. And that in of itself has definitely spurred industry around fertility that is a whole mess of very interesting kind of both things that work, but also totally snake oil stuff. I think is also quite interesting, but that's kind of an aside. But yeah, the freezing of the woman in this kind of state of almost perpetual adolescence, I think, is in some senses, because I wonder about this. Because men are at this form and then they kind of stable for most of their life. Often men also died for exogenous reasons. So they would just kind of have that form and then something would happen and then that was it. They didn't age principally in the same way as women. And they were kind of initiated into masculinity through traditions and through mysteries. Often the older men in the society had these kind of mysteries that the boys got initiated into once they went through some sort of ritual where they had to kind of prove their courage and their commitment to the cult of masculinity, basically, in the community. Whereas women, yeah. And women, you just got your period. And then you had to go, and then, once you did that and you got married, You went through the initiation that is pregnancy. Holy shit, man. Like your entire body changes. Like this is no small activity. I mean, like imagine an initiation ritual where you have an alien implanted inside of your body that sucks all of the resources from your, all the way down to your bones, right? Like that your hormones change. Your body is completely charged by these other kinds of drives. Suddenly you have this alien that's, sending you signals to eat certain kinds of foods and to do certain kinds of activities. You become immobile. You can't even move. Your consciousness is like stuck in this like ballooning body with like engorged and sore breasts. And you're just like, oh my God, it's like your digestive system gets all out of whack. And then you have to go through the riskiness of birth, which is of course something that in history, like women often died in their first, especially in their first birth, because it was so risky. These damn heads that we have, these huge heads, women have had to bear the cost of that. And multiple pregnancies also change the body of a woman. And then you go through menopause. God's sake. I mean, menopause is a crazy process. And you come out the other side, actually like the androgen. It's fascinating. Nassim Nicholas Taleb, I think, talks about this so well when he speaks of the power of the grandmother. These aggressive women who are like, he has a great story in Lebanon where like the war was happening and the soldiers would kind of come by and harass people, and of a grandmother coming out, wagging her finger at these soldiers, and the soldiers being like, okay, well, we won't bother you, because these grandmothers have this like crazy aggressive energy because they have more testosterone in their bodies. They start to grow hairs like men, and in that sense, there's this like period of time in a woman's life when she's old where she does kind of become the androgen just by virtue of how her body changes throughout her life. And that is such a Dionysian thing. It's just this like process of becoming, of changing, of continual metamorphosis, continual kind of processing your own identity as these situations happen upon you. And the shifting kind of relationship that you have to your own body when these kind of alien forces are acting on it continuously throughout your life cycle. And then, I mean, for me, that leads me to go to this position of like, well, this is the full life cycle that a woman can go through. This is like the kind of peak. And for me, I'm like embracing of that. I'm like, okay, that's it. That's like reaching the kind of potential of the female form. But I think a lot of women are trying to manipulate it in some way or another, either through plastic surgery or through birth control or some of these other types of interventions using technology, because they're attracted to some other kind of life trajectory that basically tries to postpone or change what those things look like.
Because perhaps
there's an analogous way in which the men are also being trapped in a kind of adolescence. Certainly, I think contemporary men, a lot of us, and I say this kind of myself included in the conversations I'm having in men's work, have really cut off from feelings of aggression and abilities to express aggression and abilities to assert themselves. In certain circles, it's still prevalent. I mean, interestingly, I think sometimes it's more prevalent in working class culture than it is in middle class culture. And, I think a big element of that actually is the loss of warfare. For most men, for most of history, it was always a possibility that you were going to have to pack up and leave your family and never know if you were going to come back. You were just going to be with the guys on the road. Some of you were going to die. And so we also developed psychological coping strategies for that, like intense attachment to group identity and to teams, which still plays out a bit today in football and in football rivalry, right? Mm-hmm. It's like football is basically the stadium, the place where men ritualize their conflicts. And again, it's a primarily working class thing. I mean, a lot of kind of elite business types like the top teams, but local small town football is like warfare. for guys, right? And I think, again, we're at this point as guys in the men's movement of asking, like, how can we like relearn what it means to be aggressive and assertive at times and not be scared of that empathic energy again, right? But then also because, you know, in the Freudian way, there is you don't get away from any of this shit. The repressed always returns. And certainly going back to this idea of pornography, there's often something quite violent in male consumption of pornography, especially if it slips out of being just enjoyment and into something more compulsive or addictive, right? I mean, for one thing, it's a kind of, you see the comments on Pornhub where guys saying, I don't know why I'm here. I'm miserable. I just do this because I've got nothing else to do, right? It becomes an act of like real self-sabotage, of self-destruction, which is the warlike instinct taken to oneself. That's basically what that is. And then, but then also in a kind of darker way, there's this kind of anonymous attempt to capture imagery, pictures of women from like hacking them, revenge porning them. And I was describing it the other day. It's almost like it's that barbarian instinct to take what you can when you're plundering a foreign on the internet, in the 80% of it that is porn. You can have whatever you want and you can do whatever you want. And guys run themselves off cliffs. Like, I've met guys who have just got into trouble for illegal stuff, right? And these are not like this kind of stereotype of a pedophile porn consumer is some like twisted, fucked up human. No, 9 times out of 10, they're just guys who fucking walked off a cliff. They didn't quite know what was happening. They got wrapped up in the orgy of it, and they were like, how can I push more boundaries? How can I get something that feels kind of edgy in a sense, something that feels dangerous, right? And that, again, like, I think guys, well, where there's no danger, actually going towards illegal stuff, there is a danger there, a self-sabotaging danger all at once.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, this principle of aggression, I think, you know, we're also seeing it particularly in teenage girls who, you know, they cut themselves. There's these like kind of mimetic suicides. There's also mimetic like transitioning that's happening. And I totally like anorexia, right? Like there's these kinds of things that girls and young women also go through in terms of their aggression turning kind of inward into their own beings. And I think something of this is about the kind of developmental characteristics of adolescence, where you're super sensitive to the judgment of others, which is essentially what you're learning. You know, as a child, you kind of like act aggressively, unprincipably. You don't care when you push the kid over in the playground. Your parent has to come and wag their finger at you in order for you to understand that there's some sort of punishment. It's not the feeling, the panging of pain that you've hurt someone, so much as some authority telling you that you should not be doing that thing, that ends up kind of teaching you that, oh, that's a bad behavior and I shouldn't act that way. Whereas when you're in high school, you know, if you're ostracized from your group because you've done something or you're weird or whatever, you feel the pangs of that pain internally, and it ruminates and it grows, and it actually can turn into this like wicked eye that turns towards yourself internally, where you just like totally destroy yourself. And it's really interesting, the parallel of what's actually happening in the brain at that time, where your neurons are pruning. They're literally destroying themselves. So there is this kind of weird kind of thing going on where you have this like physical process happening of the pruning of like pathways that had been, you know, part of you in childhood. And then this like hanging and identification with group and like this need to be accepted. And when those things don't happen, or you perceive that as not happening, it could even be a fabrication of your mind. It's not even necessarily something that literally happens to you. It's almost like a specter or a ghost. And you attack yourself internally for these for these things that aren't good about you or whatever. And I think you can see this pattern really being accentuated with teenage girls on the internet. Their aggression works really well, kind of in the ontological design of the internet, and how they attack each other. And so I think that it's something, and this maybe goes back to the idea of the pathic energy having principles both in the masculine and in the feminine. And it's kind of, it's suppression, kind of, I think the middle class kind of bourgeois way in which you're putting it, I think is really spot on. It's something that exists within the middle class. And because we're like, we're trying to like be proper and act the right way and suppress ourselves in order to become good capitalist subjects and all of these things. So I don't know, I definitely see that there's maybe this goes back to the idea of ideology or conditions kind of arising out of things that are, the container of our existence, and we're just kind of responding to them. And you'll see this principle operating with men and with women. And it's easy to just think, oh, it's just men. It's not. It's really not.
I think I tend to talk from that side because that's what I know. But no, I think you've done a good job at like showing me that. I think there's this kind of like warlike drive in it, but there's much more of it, right? As you've laid out, there's this like we all have this kind of will to aggression or destruction. I was wondering as you were talking, actually, if it will have been different in the past, if these ostracizing social dynamics in teenagers are a bizarre byproduct of this weird thing we've invented called school, where we just create a pen of kids who are all the same age by some arbitrary ring done around their birthdays and say, right, you guys all hang out with each other now, and the teachers are going to give you some lessons, but other than that, you just kind of go and do your own thing and organize your social circle as you see fit, which is fine, but it's very different from the more tribal or kind of village-like dynamics where there would be elders, but also just people a few years older who you'd have to hang out with to do the stuff, to do farming with, to go hunting with, to go and do business with. And I imagine, speculation, that those figures would be the types that when there were ostracism dynamics going on back in our ancestors, they'd go, all right, guys, come on, like you're falling out, but let's bring it back together because you actually need each other in some sense. Whereas now it's possible to just kick a kid out of the social circle and say, I don't want to play with you anymore. Or, oh, she's not cool. She's boring. Fuck her. Done. There's no consequences to the group of doing that anymore. And so if you happen to be that kid who is booted out and then also don't have a mentor or an older kid, maybe there's even an older kid who goes, I was booted out 10 years ago too, but you know what? Like we went and we just went off to the woods and smoked a load of weed and started talking to the gods, and now everybody listens to us. If you don't have that, then it's like, oh my God, it's time for Tumblr depressing pictures. And that goes nasty.
Yeah, I'm kind of wondering too, like the bringing up the idea of school. I think, yes, intergenerational stuff was definitely more prevalent for adolescents. Once you kind of like hit the beginning of your puberty, it was like, oh, you're an adult now. Like, okay, like you're going to get married, or you're going to go into the workforce, or, you're going to go become an apprentice for somebody. You're treated like an adult. We've extended adolescence to like 25. I'm 25. I still feel like I'm still kind of hanging on to some adolescent things, and I'm like trying to get them off of me, like the kind of adultification process. But oh my God, yeah, it's just this is like, once again, this is like a kind of an inherited state of being, kind of growing up at this time. But I was also thinking about, we were kind of talking about this principle of like spaces, physical spaces, institutions kind of forming in the minds of people, kind of intuitions about reality, and how being in school where you have like a single kind of authority of a teacher with a huge group of students of the same age, I think that the power dynamics of that situation are really atrocious. When you're one young person or maybe two, young people of the same age in a band where there are all of these older people and you are at the bottom of a hierarchy, it's very clear. And you have to kind of find yourself within this system a very like deep political system. I mean, of like relationships between all these people who have long-standing dynamics between one another. It's a very different kind of world to be initiated into. You get very different kinds of intuitions about what it is that you're inheriting. But when you go into school and there's like one teacher and there's all these students of the same age, like no wonder people are being drawn into mass politics. You know, where like there's this like big boogeyman, like bad authority figure, that all of the, all the kids or the teenagers are like righteously kind of banding together to like take down the phallus and rise, like that's totally the dynamic of these groups. And I think, yeah, you're spot on in terms of kind of maybe finding that as being a source where we gain our intuitions about the world, but end up being really misled about how things actually genuinely work. And that in and of itself is a kind of hole that's opened up in our landscape where people are just kind of falling into. And then you also have these dynamics of back into the idea of like Onlyfans or whatever, where there's like big hole where most people are falling into, but there's this like one kind of angelic figure that kind of controls all of what is going into the hole. The authority, but for OnlyFans, it's like, it doesn't look like an authority. It just looks like a beautiful woman. But really, I mean, she's definitely holding down some kind of territory, but the territory is a big hole that you fall into. I don't know. Those are just some like random thoughts I had from what you were saying.
I just wanted to say something which is like tying back to like a couple of cycles before in this conversation, which is the idea that the acceptance or rejection of perhaps the natural progression of the life cycle of a person, whether they're man or woman, is something that just smells so much like Dugin's critique of liberalism. And, caveat, Dugin, Russian agent, whatever. Is that everything is made optional. You don't have to be a man. You can just fucking work.
Exactly.
You don't have to go out there and actually do something. For women, there's probably something similar. You just had something to that effect previously. And it feels definitely that, this is all instantiated within liberalism, within the optional nature of of liberalism, that you can be something, but you don't have to. You can choose always, as long as you can pay. It also falls into this hyper-individualistic, hyper-Cartesian, boxed-in way of seeing the individual as the master subject of society, right? That it's up to me to choose what I want to do with myself and all that. And even in spite of perhaps deeper dynamics in our own evolution. Not that I'm making a moral judgment whether people want to do that or not, but just that's sort of the outline that I'm making out here.
Oh yeah.
And then there's this final idea, which is, liberalism came because it was a way to respond to the changing conditions of industrial production, of the Industrial Revolution. Suddenly there's a lot of wealth, there's a lot of commerce, there's a lot of people, and we somehow have to deal with this. It's complicated. We've tried different ideologies as per Dugan, right? Communism, fascism, liberalism kind of stood. Liberalism also has its own ways of institution disciplinary power. Let's get all the kids in the same age. Let's have one teacher over there. Let's invent a prison. Let's invent a madhouse for the undesirables. Let's invent all those Foucauldian apparatuses that are ways to sort of manage power that are, they instantiate bad power relationships, or rather oppressive, or like it's not really nice to look at them. But on the other hand, we have, the population just exponentially rose, so we kind of got to deal with this somehow. And that's kind of the conundrum where we're at, right? It's that the grand chessboard of human resources has, reached a point where there's a fuckload of us, and the regulatory mechanisms that would have existed before do not apply anymore. I guess we're just going around in circles again in this conversation. And it gets to the point where people are trying to come up with different solutions, even when it comes to different ways to be. And I think that's why ontological design is the last breath of liberalism, because it's okay. You can be anything you want. Here's the fucking gun.
Yeah, but can you?
That's going to be a hell of an experiment, but probably, I mean, be whatever you want.
Yeah, I don't know, and not to get into some sort of weird like bio-Leninist thing, but like, it's and I think this gets back to the receptivity thing of the pathos, right? It's like, if you kind of purge yourself of all of these ideas, even the idea that you can be anything, right? And you just kind of get down and see what arises. It's funny because the authority, or like the thing that tells you what you need to do, the necessity, the authority, like deciding for you, comes up almost immediately. It's like, you're like, oh, this is my mission. This is my thing. I don't know where it's leading. I can't like plan it from up on high. I can't pull the puppet strings of my own intuition, but I feel a sense of certainty that this is where I have to place my risk. And I think that that's the other thing. It's about risk. And this is where people are caught. They're afraid on so many levels. There's so much fear and anxiety and just like depression and rumination. And I think, it's the sense of needing to know that things are going to work out, that you're going to get that thing that you expect, which comes from the ontological design of commodification, where you're guaranteed as the customer that if you exchange X amount of dollars, you're going to get the service or product that you're paying for. And people have tended towards that type of exchange rather than going into the Wild West of going out in a bar and, striking up a conversation with a strange woman, not knowing what's going to happen, not knowing if she's going to reject or accept you. That kind of activity requires bravery, and it requires a home inside of you. I mean, especially if you're someone who doesn't just already have that, right? Because some of us are just, I'm like an extrovert. I go up and talk to anybody. Like, I just like I'm like almost obtuse. Like, I'm almost like kind of like dumb when it comes to knowing when I'm not supposed to talk to someone or something like that. But not everybody's like that. Some people are like, oh, should I say something? Like, what do I do? Like, there's a kind of like sense of being on the edge. And then instead of opening up, blooming like a flower, you turn back in and you're like, I'll just go on my computer. I'll just look up some porn. I'll just do this thing instead. I know what I'm going to get if I do this. I don't know what I'm going to get if I listen to this intuition. But when you really kind of purge all of these ideas, and also the idea that you can do anything, I really genuinely think that it can be very paralyzing to think that, I could just select from anything. You get really bad intuitions about what that means, I think, just by how the question is framed to us in this kind of advertising kind of, branding world. But if you go ahead.
I agree with you. I wanted to add this idea that it's a non-specific amplifier. It's just amplifies a lot. What it amplifies, it's not my prerogative, I guess. Or rather, it's not. You mentioned hierarchy, and maybe it's the prerogative for me and my own, and that's one thing. But within liberalism, it's each individual for themselves.
Yeah, and I think it gives people like kind of, and I think maybe it's the interface of that question of, it's almost like maybe a better framing is like, the amplifier, like you can be what you don't expect yourself to be if you tap into some sort of arising or becoming that maybe even your kind of planning mind could never have predicted. You become the gambler, but you're gambling on your own treasure. You're gambling on your own possibility. And you're leaning on the divination process of gambling. Like, that's a kind of thing where, yes, right now, like we all had this intuition to come together and speak. We didn't know what kind of treasure we would find in this interaction, but now we've kind of created a whole new, like, forking of reality that leads to more betting, more divination, more playing in the space of mystery and moving towards the light, and that's a kind of becoming, and this unbounded becoming that I think is the right intuition of this question of you can be anything that you want. But too many people, I think, are frozen by this concept because they see it interfacing with this commodification process where you're guaranteed to be the thing that you think you want to become if you exchange in the proper manner. And it's like, no. In fact, like, that's not really guaranteed to you. You don't have the right to become anything. You have the right to become who you are.
This is like what we were talking about with Chris Gabriel, the topic. We were talking about the idea that everything is permitted, right? The death of God and the ultimate kind of liberal flag in the ground. But the issue with that is that there's just like a billion distractions. There's a billion wrong directions to go in. And like you were saying, there's one that is the correct direction to go in. And I think the point, as Daniel got to with ontological design, is it's the tool for both of those. For those who are able to tap into the expression of nature within themselves, then it is a mechanism for crafting your day-to-day reality, your day-to-day ontology, your interfaces, your environment, your relationships in a way that carries you further down that path. But then for everybody else, it's you get to watch whatever porn you want to watch all the fucking time, which we kind of already have, right? But just once we get virtual reality and we get whatever else the fuck is coming our way, then that's the way it's going to be. Now, something I'm kind of curious to open up here, it's something that Karel Last and I were talking about the other day. Brings in this kind of Zizekian, Hegelian digital reading of how he thinks a lot of the power dynamics that exist today will resolve themselves, or certainly the way that whatever that Zizekian Hegelian way would hope them to.
And with this, he broke.
And that's it. Oh no.
You're back. Okay.
What's happened?
Wind back.
I'm back.
Hegelian progression.
I broke the internet with the fucking words. So anyhow, we've had the religious wars and the racial wars. Now we're at this level where we're battling. We're still battling over race, and we're battling over gender. As we move into cyberspace and the possibility to create ever more weird and wacky avatars comes up, the conflict, if there's a conflict that exists between male and female, the conflict that exists between black and white becomes less and less meaningful, especially if there is a digital platform on which all digital resources are distributed, or at least in a way that everybody can kind of, as I said, like euphemistically get the porn that they want to watch, right? How does this sound as a resolution to the power conflicts that we face today?
I love your face.
Mm.
I agree with you already. I told this to Lauren previously, which is maybe not.
Yeah, pull the face as well. You both do the same face. It will look beautiful.
Virtual worlds.
I guess I'm just, so are you interested in like kind of anticipating resolution? Is that kind of why you're going down this path of trying to kind of predict where the next inflection point is for conflict? Is that kind of what you're
it's an interesting topic to riff on. Essentially, it's like it's kind of a post-human question. It's will we overcome the limitations placed on us by biology and by geography when we can design our ontologies and our realities with digital tools increasingly so? And no, I don't have the answer to this, but I think it's a kind of fruitful ground for picking apart. I mean, a counter argument to the point, it's exactly what we've been saying, right? You might be able to create yourself in any image you want to be, but 99 out of those 100 images are just going to be kind of worthless pixels on a screen.
99 of those images are going to be hot girls. Let's be real.
This end game.
I mean, it's like, you can say that, I don't know, it's almost, I think that was maybe part of the utopian vision of the internet in the beginning, was like, oh, it's going to resolve all these human conflicts. And in fact, what we've found is that they've actually accentuated underlying human conflict. And it's been about the level of appearance in some sense. And maybe that's just a kind of social media like accentuation, but I mean, I don't necessarily see it as like this infinite kind of like, fuel for human conflict. I think that we probably will move to a new front. Maybe we already are, but most people are kind of falling into the pit of the conflict, like let's say between black and white, or even between male and female. But maybe there's some sort of deeper conflict going on. Maybe that is kind of going back the way that I've been formulating a kind of possible front of conflict is between sex. Sex is a principle of biological life and replication, right? Of technology, or like, a virus, a kind of parasitical kind of entity. And when these things come together, I think that's a singularity point that I'm kind of interested in about what will happen to sex. What will happen to sex? What will happen to sexually reproducing organisms when this inflection point is reached? And I think maybe we're seeing the hints of that with the intervention of birth control, let's say, or like the invention of sex robots or pornography that kind of like takes the pathic energy of a demographic and kind of like, once again, pit of Tartarus, just like goes in and just like sucks it all in, and that's it. And then you have a kind of the sterilization that can occur with birth control, the choice to just like postpone that transformative process of fertility as a principle of like the female cycle, but then also of pregnancy. But I don't know. I'm still working on this idea because I'm still kind of interested in how do we define the like replicating this kind of like whatever the equivalent of sex is for the machine. I'm still very interested in that question because that's to me kind of where these things. Yes, Daniel, you seem like you're excited to talk.
He always is.
I know, I love it.
Co-domestication. So this idea that, that which we have done to wolves and brought them into our purses as chihuahuas, it might also be happening to us through the hands of a few humans, or the hands of the autonomous spectacle, or the hand of some super intelligent machine. But simultaneously, we will also be guiding somehow the machine. So it does feel like the start of a process or a moment where deliberate domestication, deliberate channeling and diversion of the evolutionary river will be a technology that is more and more available, right? We see that already with ideology, with ideas, with, I don't know if you know the idea autocult from Pat Ryan's stuff, right? So the more we advance into this territory where you have all sorts of players trying to pursue and engage in a marketplace competition to get this technology, to get the technology to automate cults, to automate belief, I think it's just a logical next step until that becomes CRISPR, until that becomes sort of subliminal eugenics, until that becomes, broadly speaking, a sort of process where humanity is going to self-domesticate drastically in many directions. Maybe we're talking about speciation. It's going to be weird, but I think it's going to be also, we're going to be, whether we like it or not, we're going to be active, deliberate participants in it. Or rather, if we want to be, we can. If we want to leave that to us, it will be done to us.
Yep. Absolutely.
Yeah. Like, I think as you say, these kind of auto-cultic new power dynamics will emerge, whatever post-human stratosphere we blast off into. Like, I think the kind of Hegelian digital communist point is precisely that the virtual avatar presents a new universality that overcomes and completely meaningless the previous subject positions. It's like another attempt at the individual of the Enlightenment French Revolution, which, you know, McLuhan is fucking brilliant at pointing out how the individual is a powerful political idea because it frees people from being identified with locality, with dialect, with regions. You all become at least individual citizens of a nation, with the kind of inherent prospect that you will eventually become an individual citizen of the world. With liberalism, it's you become a free rational capitalist agent in a free market. And within communism, it's you become one of the united world proletariat, right? But unfortunately, the kind of what happened, what it got exposed in the 20th century was that the individual subject position is a nice intellectual abstraction, but it just doesn't map onto the flesh, basically. There are still different skin colors and different body shapes, different degrees of attractiveness, different degrees of intelligence, different degrees of hormones. So they throw out the idea of the avatar, the virtual avatar, as the new universality, in a sense, the new post-individual individual. But I don't see how that won't also be subject to its own power formulations, especially because I think there's no assumption that resources will be equally distributed if we do move into a predominantly digital space. In fact, it'll probably be the complete opposite. As you say, Raven, it'll be 99 hot chicks, and like the person who's able to make the hottest avatar will win again and again and again, because unless we're able to exercise our flesh sex drives, and perhaps some people will. I think that's the real interesting post-human question, right? Is like when at the moment a lot of women are cyborgs because they take the birth control, right? What happens when people have designer pills to give you whatever chemical state you want, but then also user interfaces that can ontologically shape you into whatever kind of weird and wacky human being you want to be, whether you want to be a lotus eater all day long or a world eater who is biocybernetically modified to be able to stay up 25 hours a day and crunch numbers so that you can run the best damn Amazon business ever.
China.
What is it? Neo China arrives from the future.
with this narration, China, whatever he does.
China. I don't know. I mean, different people will do different things. I mean, maybe that's something that like will be kind of the mass, like, you know, people who accept this ontology of the individual as subject will maybe be attracted to articulating or actualizing themselves in that kind of environment. But I don't know. I think that at least the way that I have, you know, connection to self, it's like, I mean, I'm burrowing deeper and deeper and deeper and deeper into the biological as my like source of connectedness to the world. I mean, I think that that's why like I'm interested in the metaphysics of sex as a dynamic between like organisms, as a relationship of DNA, of like a property of DNA, and how it recombines and creates all of these diverse forms, and the intelligence of this being. And I think maybe it almost relates to faith in some sense. It's like, what do we have faith in here? Like, if we're going to weather through this crazy shit that's coming, crazy shit. I mean, I think, you know, what Daniel outlined of this kind of, you know, autocult acceleration, and Owen, what you're talking about in terms of what that might look like on these digital platforms, I think that's just one slice of like the possible kind of outcomes, the way that this may show up, particularly what our children may be finding themselves interacting with, and their grandchildren, if they happen. I mean, that's the thing of it. Like, if people don't reproduce, we're going to have a huge collapse in population. How many avatars will there be? Is this just kind of what people who aren't going to reproduce, they like take their drive towards legacy, towards future, and they make themselves into these like avatars that could exist as specters online forever? You know, that somehow there's a kind of death drive operating in this way of being driven towards imprinting oneself on the digital landscape. Maybe that's part of it, but I still think that there is so much power in the extended nature of lineage, of flesh, of being of a body. And that fact that that body goes all the way back. Like, we are part of an unbroken continuous line. That's just a fact. And we can perpetuate that into the future. That is something that we can do. And like, I feel like doing that now, especially who we are, like, you know, there's some sense of which, like, and I don't know what your backgrounds are, what you were raised in, but like, I think that kind of, for me, like living in a progressive household, kind of having to push through all of this stuff and kind of arrive at the other side at something else, you know, not merely a kind of reactionary position, but something that is attempting to do something new. I'm not trying to bring back the past. I don't want to live in a museum, but like facing the future, but also connecting deeply beyond just, you know, neo-feudalism or whatever it is, whatever future people want to place into reality now, but all the way back to sex, to the origins of life, and saying, no, that's my lineage. You know, I am in connection to this force that is on this planet. And do I have faith in what it's doing? And it's both its disgust, you know, it's like nature to destroy, and it's kind of paradoxical quality that it seems to be creating the conditions of our own extinction. Like the fact that it has those properties, but it also has this like ability to continue to get into the future over and over and over and again through these bottlenecks. You know, I think that there's a mystery there. Once again, like there's a mystery there. And I wonder if that's what we're tasked with, like letting it, you know, arise through us and investigating. I don't know. Maybe we're getting mystical, but
that was amazing. I feel like described is one way to talk about Yggdrasil, the tree of life. You know, even in the Kabbalah, the endless lineage that is unbroken from the vast east, from the vast origin that goes even before life, where how far we don't know, and that will continue to the vast future. And this belongingness is almost like when Heidegger talks about being itself and the sign, and that's the deeper root of it. It feels like, you know, there are cycles to Yggdrasil. Maybe when we're talking about, you know, evolutionary bottlenecks, we're talking about many of its leaves. Their fall is coming, and they're going to fall. They're not going to be pruned because there's no big war, but they're going to fall of their own lack of vitality and connection to the source. Still waters in a swamp. I read this somewhere today, referring to, you know, when some people are so disconnected from the source, they become the definition of zombies who live in swamps. Swamps are still waters, as opposed to connected to the big river. And, you know, you just said the word faith there, so I felt impelled to talk about Yggdrasil and these deeper concepts, you know, vril, chakra, chi. Very, very cool, very interesting. Any more thoughts, Owen? Or do we think that we're, you know, after 2.5 hours at a good place to wrap up?
I mean, there's so much more to say, but we can talk later too. I think this was a really great introduction.
The season, you got like 2 episodes right here. We're gonna invent like 3 more in our next session.
I love that this is investigation. You know, like I think that that's so important, is like to be curious. I love this idea that Bard talks about with antagony, right? Like, let's stress each other, like let's get into this stuff, and that there's a kind of openness, like there actually is a frontier. We don't know what the fuck we are doing. And like, that's what makes this so interesting and exciting. Like, what an amazing time to be alive, you know? And there's so much pessimism. People feel like they're like at the end of the world and like everything's horrible. And it's like, okay, look at this beautiful thing. Look at this craziness. Like, there's something to embrace here. And I'm so grateful that I could come and talk to you guys and work on some of these ideas with you. It's super great, gratifying.
Beautiful. It feels like we're at the edge of the world sphere, like at the present, like not only us here now, but maybe collectively and maybe both at the same time, who knows, synchronicities, that we're like at this the present time, we're at the edge of something. We're on the verge, on the cusp of perhaps having the ability to steer. Cybernetics has the roots on the Greek word steering. So maybe that's what we're trying to do.
Yeah, there's something really beautiful about just being in a genuinely creative bubble of culture, essentially. As you said, we don't know where we're going, but we're pretty open to exploring it together, which I think is just actually not that present in late stage capitalism. Essentially, it's like what Jordan Hall talks about with simulated thinking, and again, like trying to preserve the complicated structures instead of shifting into complex mode, which is like number one, accepting like, okay, A, something's happening, B, I have no fucking idea what's happening, and then building from there. And I feel very fortunate, having been primed by spending like coming of age in my teenage years in like the heavy metal subcultures, which was like an intensely creative, participatory subculture. And so it's like what I've kind of always intuitively known since being a kid, right, was like there's a bubble that exists outside of the mainstream world. Like it's not talked about in the mainstream world. There's no real ways into it from the mainstream world. I just happened to buy guitar today, and then I heard like Iron Maiden, Metallica, and I was like, wow. And that's probably how I've wound up here, to be honest with you, with fucking Guitar Hero 3.
Once in the future.
Yeah. Well, to many more.
Absolutely. You're very welcome to come back anytime.
Great. I would love to. And I'm looking forward to see what happens. We'll see what comes of all of this, what kind of mysteries we're dealing with. We are not at the end of history. History is moving again.
We are history.
We are history.
Fuck you, Francis.
Fuck you.
So that said, thank you, Technosocialists. We'll see you on the next. We hope you enjoyed the show. Consider becoming our patron and helping us put out more content like this.
Patreon.com/technosocial.